for those of you not joining us here on the West Coast. My name is Basil Sadek. I'm the Marketing Associate here at VolunteerMatch, and I want to welcome you to our Nonprofit Insight Series, Stories and Solutions that Shape the Future of Volunteer Screening. In today's webinar, we're sharing more than 15 positive and negative volunteer screening stories from your peers and in the news. We also invite you to submit your own story to share with our listeners as well. Don't worry, if you do submit your own story, we won't mention your name or your organization. We also have brilliant facilitators today from VolunteerMatch partner SureID to help us facilitate the conversation. But before we get started, I did just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. First off, all of you are on an automatic mute, so you don't need to worry about any background noise on your part. Just because we can't hear your voice doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. You should see a GoToWebinar toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Once you open that toolbar up, you'll see the word questions with either a plus sign or an arrow sign next to it, and that's your questions tool. Please feel free to type in your questions as we go through the webinar, and we'll start answering them towards the middle and towards the end. I am also going to be live tweeting, so if you're Twitter savvy and would like to ask a question there or join in the conversation, you can do so using the hashtag VMLearn, as in VolunteerMatchLearn. We're also launching 2 Twitter polls today. The first poll went live a few minutes ago and asked, have you ever had to dismiss a volunteer at your organization? The answer choices there are either yes or no, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. If you answered yes, go ahead and tell us your story. We can keep it anonymous or we can keep it private and not share it. Just please, let us know. Let us know it's fun. Our second Twitter poll will go live in about 10 minutes and asks, have you ever had a positive experience vetting volunteers at your organization? Again, the answer choices are yes or no, and then feel free to let us know if you want to share your story. The easiest way to weigh into today's Twitter poll is either by searching the hashtag VMLearn or typing twitter.com/volunteermatch in your web browser. Take a moment to add your response and see how you fare with other volunteer managers. All right, let's get started.
First of all, we are so excited to be here today because, as you've mentioned, Basil, there is so much fabulous content in our webinar today about your experiences as nonprofits and volunteers out there. And we have so much to learn, and there's so much great news as well in this process. One thing that we wanted to point out to our webinar attendees, if they wanted to go back to April 27th, Greg Baldwin had a fabulous webinar where he talked about a survey that VolunteerMatch had run on both nonprofits and volunteers. And during that webinar, we came up with several challenges that every nonprofit is facing today when it comes to screening volunteers. And we broke it down into 3 areas. And one of them was verifying identity. Sherelle, can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that nonprofits are facing when it comes to screening their volunteers today and the things that kept resurfacing as we had surveyed over 600 nonprofits?
I think one of the main topics that was trending that we saw over and over again during that webinar was, is a volunteer who they claim to be? Again, one of the compelling statistics was in the survey one that told us that 78% of nonprofits surveyed are concerned about volunteer trustworthiness. And again, that goes back to, are these people who they claim to be? And then again, 57%, which was great, of the nonprofits that performed background checks, as opposed to 32% who rarely or never perform background screens. So that was something that came through loud and clear, was that the nonprofits felt that it was a value for them, for their volunteers to be properly screened. So those were some really positive, statistics that we saw with that webinar.
Right, and we also saw that cost and inconvenience and just lacking clarity on exactly what a background screen is, what it involves, who's going to pay for it. And that's one reason we're having this webinar, is because more and more we're seeing in the national headlines the need for background screening of volunteers working especially with children in vulnerable populations, and that volunteers themselves can contribute to their credential or identity assurance, or all the different terms that sometimes we're going to come across, as a way to offset the cost for the nonprofit. And they consider it as part of their total contribution package to the nonprofit. But really what we're here today to talk about is everybody's stories. We came with an abundance of submissions this morning from our listening audiences, and what I want to say from my days in radio, but I know it's from our webinar attendees and nonprofits who are very excited to hear from each other, I think more than to hear from us, right, Cheryl?
Exactly.
So we're asking you to take the stage, and we've asked you to tell us what your experience is. And many of you have submitted stories, and you're going to hear them at length. And one thing I wanted to remind everyone is that you can send your questions and comments now in the comments section on GoToWebinar. And I can't promise that we'll get to all of them during the webinar, but I can promise that every question will be followed up, you know, in an email, a follow-up email that we will send out to webinar attendees, as well as our Twitter poll that Basil is started. Basil, I don't know if you're able to join us, but if you want to remind people about the Twitter poll at #VMLearn and what the question is. Post animal shelter. And Maddie writes in saying, "Hi Basil, we ask on our volunteer application if volunteers have been convicted of a crime in the past 7 years, but we don't background check volunteers unless they will be working off-site with children. A volunteer answered no to the question about convictions in the past 7 years, and he was accepted and started volunteering on-site as a dog walker. Another volunteer befriended him and started giving him rides home because he doesn't own a car. She found out that when he was recently released from prison and had been in jail for 10 years for child molestation. This volunteer became very uncomfortable and ended up changing her shift so that she wouldn't have to see him. Had we known about the conviction and jail time ahead of time, we probably would have passed." Sherelle, this story is a little bit concerning, isn't it? Because even though he was maybe honest about not having been convicted in the last 7 years, he had just come out of jail and was not forthright about that. So what could have been done differently in this story?
Well, and this is a great case of having a thorough background screen, because if there was a thorough background screen, then it would have caught this individual's history. And again, it's not just about protecting the vulnerable population bases of the nonprofits, it's also about protecting your other volunteers. And, you know, this is, you know, unfortunate because this was a really good volunteer and she stayed with the organization, but she, you know, changed her shift so that she wasn't uncomfortable around this individual. And so, you know, the value of a good, thorough background screen is, one, it does protect your vulnerable population bases, but it also protects your volunteers. And I think that that, again, is a value of having that as a part of your practice as a nonprofit.
Right, and making a really good and trusted volunteer uncomfortable is a really unfortunate circumstance. And if he had been upfront about it and let them know that, hey, I just got out of jail, if you ran a background screen, you'd find a couple things. That's really the basis for trust, for building a great relationship. And we actually have a couple news stories to that regard. Our second story that we have is from TR in the southern United States. And he works in crisis management with people that are in really sensitive situations. And he writes in, "Hi Basil, we've noticed that background screening can be particularly helpful simply because there are occasions when someone will not consent to the background check. We feel that a situation has been proactively avoided, and he says that with an exclamation point. If they won't consent, we don't need them, and we won't use them. Peace and blessings, all the best to you. TR writes in from Mississippi.
Well, and again, Naomi, this is a perfect example of someone that uses this background screen as a deterrent. A background screen is a powerful deterrent, and it's a great way for a nonprofit to weed out people who could potentially put their organization at risk.
Exactly. I was wondering with TR, how I'm really curious to see how he responds to people when they refuse to, he probably has a few lessons to teach others and how to respond when someone refuses a background screen, because that's always can be a tricky situation. The third one that we have is from Troy. He's an avid volunteer who has given time to 3 organizations in the past year. During his volunteer shift, he's either helped collect funds at a gala or watched over some very expensive equipment to ensure that it doesn't get stolen. He was surprised that he didn't need to go through a background screen in order to take on these responsibilities. So, Sherelle, what is Troy actually saying to us?
Well, again, you have this is a good volunteer, and most people aren't going to be forthcoming as Troy. And, again, volunteers will have more confidence in volunteering for organizations if they know there are sound back screening practices that are in place. And this is a perfect example of that. And you want to have faith and think the best of most people, but there are those people that aren't trustworthy. It only takes one individual that will put your organization at risk. And, it's really important for nonprofits to have a sound background screening service as a part of their practices.
Correct. The next one we have is Kendall writing in from a West Coast major civic institution, and something came up during an audit, which is really actually surprising for an institution that has probably a multi-million-dollar budget and is a large organization, right? Having a lot of volunteers. He writes, I worked with a major civic institution which raised a sizable amount of money after a long capital campaign, and in an extensive organization-wide audit, it led to the executive director stepping down. That's never good news, is it, Sherelle?
No.
But while establishing the best practices and searching for a new executive director, it came to light through the board of directors meeting that the organization, which has at least 100 or more underage volunteers, not only did not have background screening policies in place for hiring its executive leadership, its employees, or its volunteers. Due to this liability issue, the board immediately took action to rectify these policies for any future hires.
Well, again, Naomi, the board was doing their job, and the big part of a good board, is that they help to mitigate risk for nonprofits. And again, this is unusual. Such a sizable organization as this, that there wasn't a background screening policy in place, because nonprofits are targets for people that are bad actors. An important reminder why screening is to be in place to protect your organization's reputation.
Exactly. In our next story, we have Evelyn writing in from the Southeast United States. And she tells us that she lost a tax prep volunteer when she asked for a background screen. She says, hi, Basil. We lost a very good VITA tax prep volunteer who was adamant that we didn't need both his driver's license number and his social security number when doing a background check. He claims that one or the other should have been sufficient. We do use a service for background screening of our volunteers, and this is Evelyn, a community impact coordinator. What was a little bit fishy about that kind of response?
Well, to me, the biggest red flag is any time a person is reluctant to provide information regarding their background when they're volunteering, especially with vulnerable population bases. That should be an immediate red flag. again, this is an example of why a person would be ineligible for volunteering because they're not willing to be forthcoming with their background information. And you have to be really careful anytime a person is handling finances or sensitive data of any kind. There must be a comprehensive background screen process in place for that organization, again, to mitigate risk so that they don't experience loss of resources.
Right. And it's interesting, even just in the couple stories we've seen so far, we're going to review, we have like little spot and stop. I didn't call it red flags because I thought it's really great to spot things when you see them or know that your background screening can spot and then stop people. But we're going to see these little things that came up during the story that we will recap on one of the slides. Our next story is from Lana. And Lana works for a nonprofit that provides service to homeless people and families. So she says she is very serious about screening. She had an interesting experience very early on in her work as a volunteer coordinator. And she writes, "Greetings, Basil. I am reminded of some people who were interested in volunteering with my agency in my very first year as a volunteer coordinator. And I was part of helping to define the requirements for the agency, including background checks and the CAPT certificate, which is for child abuse and prevention training. And she had received police training too. She remembers meeting 3 individuals for one-on-one volunteer orientations. And she says, these are kind of key words, I think, when you're screening volunteers. She says they were charming, personable, and engaging in their own ways. But as we walked through the paperwork and requirements for volunteering, each had a very strong aversion to the background check requirements. That's interesting. They shared interesting and somewhat persuasive arguments as to why they refused to submit to the background check. Something in their persistence started to raise the hair on the back of my neck. And the one thing police trainers had always shared with us repeatedly was to trust your gut reaction." What did she say next, Sherelle?
Well, it's interesting. She says, my don't be judgmental brain was tempted to agree with these individuals, but my training and intuition kept saying no. I held firm to our requirements and surprisingly never heard the slightest frustration or outburst of any of them. Instead, they just slipped away, not to be heard of again. However, Naomi, the scary part of this story is at least one of them did go to a partner agency to volunteer within a year of meeting with her, and unfortunately caused a terrible incident at that agency. And again, it's to me, this is such an amazing story, and we're hearing some same things over and over again, just about, you got to take the personal aspect out of background screening and have a very professional policy and service in place. And it's not about, a person not having good intentions. It's about protecting your population base. And this, unfortunately, resulted in a terrible incident happening.
Right.
She
does write that from time to time, now after years of being a volunteer coordinator, from time to time people propose doing a video training for screening volunteers rather than in person. And she says, no, her gut really told her, that she's never going to go outside of the realm of having in-person meetings. And that is such a key piece of a very professional background screen, is that in-person verification. Because when somebody shows up, has to show up in person, present their documentation, get their photo taken, maybe even give fingerprints, there's no way of faking that. And it does have the advantage of deterring wrongdoers, for sure.
And kudos to Lana for helping to formulate the criteria and sticking to her police training. I think that that's really key here. There are background screeners who can catch some of these bad actors, and she had, systems and practices in place that helped her to do that.
Yeah. I loved Lana's story, and I loved how thorough she was in explaining it. Thank you, Lana. Just a reminder that these stories are anonymized, which is why I have the person's name in quotes. and so that they can't be identified, because this is a sensitive topic and people need to know that they're safe sharing their stories so that other nonprofits can learn from them, but their identity is not being revealed in this webinar. Our last story here is from Pamela. I love to end on a high note from volunteer coordinators who are very positive about the screening process and see its value. So she writes in a screening success story. She says, "Hi Basil, since stepping into the volunteer coordinator position, I have developed a process of screening volunteers that has been wonderfully successful, both in reducing the possibility of an inappropriate hire and improving volunteer placement and productivity. I have taken many of your webinars over the past 2 years, and the strategies presented are extremely useful in developing our reference check process." She says that screening now demands a lot of energy and time, but it has been hugely successful. And this is the exciting part to me, that even with all the hard work that she does in screening, she writes that in 2016, we took in 159 new volunteers who contributed nearly 3,000 hours to her organization. Many thanks to VolunteerMatch and to you, Basil, for putting on these wonderful guidance tools with these free webinars.
You know, Pamela, again, excellent example of implementing a system that accurately screens and vets volunteers. You know, it only makes the quality of your volunteer better. And this is great when nonprofits really take to heart these tools and tips as she did and apply them accordingly and have great success as a result.
Yeah, it is really exciting. We received a lot more stories, and we're making some good time this morning that we might even be able to address a few of the other questions that I put into one little bucket here on questions and comments we've heard from you. I'm wondering, Basil, if you've heard anything in our Twitter poll, if you're starting to get any traffic there or any interesting results, we'd love to have you weigh in. And we want to remind everyone to participate in the Twitter poll at #VMLearn.
Hey guys, are you able to hear me now?
I can hear you now, Basil.
Oh, good. I'm so sorry to everyone earlier today for the robotic sounds. I'm not sure what was happening, but we'll look into that and get it fixed before next time. So just to take a quick moment to recap today's Twitter poll. Earlier we asked all of you, have you ever had to dismiss a volunteer at your organization? So far, 5 of you weighed in, with 80% saying yes, and 20% saying no. That's a little surprising. I don't know that we were expecting that, but we'd love to hear your stories. Why did you have to dismiss a volunteer before? And also, if you have not weighed in, there's still time to do so. Quickest way to do it is to just visit twitter.com/volunteermatch in your web browser. And it should be the first or the second tweet up there. Back to you, Naomi.
Great. So Basil, I'm excited to hear more from people, especially at the end of our webinar today, kind of what their answers have been. A few questions and comments that we've heard from our listeners is from Marissa. What are pertinent screening questions besides the normal? And by the normal, she just means, where have you lived and what do you like to do, or why are you interested in working with our organization? And there's a lot of resources for that out there.
There are a lot of resources, and I, again, maybe being biased, but I think that, again, a core competency of a nonprofit isn't necessarily, understanding what questions to ask, and that's why I think it's always a good practice to engage with a background screening organization that have these practices in place, because it does take the question out of what questions do I ask, given that they've fine-tuned that process of questioning volunteers and or people in general for different throughout different organizations that they work with, and they've come up with some excellent standards. And so I think it's always good to consult with background screening providers, just again in the long run, just to mitigate risk, and so that you're taking yourself as a nonprofit out of the equation, and it's not personal. It's just that you're implementing practices that are going to help your organization in the long run.
Right, and just taking out that bias. This one, who was it, Lana, that told us that she had already had the police training and knew how to trust her gut, and was going to run these background screens anyways. But a lot of people working in smaller nonprofits maybe don't have all that background. So just being able to take that and send it on to a third-party professional screening service takes a lot of those screening questions away. You might want to screen for the culture of your organization.
Exactly.
But the whole piece of background screening, the reason that it has to be done is that people are dishonest with the questions that they answer.
They can be.
They can
be. Most people are good people, but sometimes you have those bad actors that do slip through the cracks, and that's why having a good system in place helps to mitigate that.
Right. And statistically, it's 6%. So Mary writes, asks us how background checks are done and how much does it cost. Mary, we are going to be looking at that a little bit later, but also that question that you asked, that your organization doesn't have any funding yet, we're looking at maybe some background screening solutions for future volunteers. That's what this is about, where volunteers are starting to own their own identity verification and background screen, and they're bringing that as an added value to the nonprofit organization so that the nonprofits aren't having to shoulder all of that.
And I think that these are excellent questions again, and I think that early on we talked about cost being a big concern for nonprofits, and I believe an option of having the volunteer contribute to the cost of their background screen helps to offset some of those concerns about cost.
Right. And some screening services, as we're going to talk about, would allow that volunteer to take their background screen possibly to another organization that would recognize it. And Julie writes in, Julie, you're one reason that we continue to have these webinars about the importance of screening volunteers, and that is that the only screening we do is a phone interview and evaluation after they begin working with us. That doesn't really catch people before they come in the door, before they have access to your organization. And she says, we wish we could do screening, but we're here to say, Sherelle, that there's creative ways to begin to look at screening and to really make it a priority.
And we'll talk about that later on. So Julie, your question will be answered later on in the webinar.
Right. We do have one question that came in here on our comments section, and that is, let me see here. Excuse me for a second while I find it. How do you know if your organization is legally required to fingerprint as part of the background check, or if you can use other methods of background check and identity verification that do not require fingerprints?
Well, background screening criteria vary state to state, and so that nonprofit would need to definitely find out, depending on where they live, what the requirements are, because some don't always require fingerprinting, but that would be a good proactive step to find out what are the requirements, what do I need to screen for when I'm screening my volunteers.
Right, and what you need to do specifically, the specific answer to that question is find out what your state requires for volunteers, and it also depends on the audience or the constituency that you're serving. And let me see if there is another question. We are going to move on to some things that we have looked at in the news. So one thing, Sherelle, that kind of warms my heart a little bit about volunteering is the opportunity that it presents for people at different places in life. We're not talking about background screening only in the context of saying that everybody that comes in to volunteer at your organization has to have a squeaky clean, perfect record. Are we saying that?
No, absolutely not. And I think, again, most people have very good intentions, but it only takes one person to put your organization at risk. And that's why you want to have good practices in place as a nonprofit to mitigate those risks. We want to assume that most people are good at heart, but we also want to have screening practices in place that catch those people that are bad actors that don't have good intentions.
And the other thing about screening is it catches people who were dishonest on their application, and that's a really key piece. The flip side of that is people that are thoroughly honest on their application, and they say right up front what it is that they've been convicted of or served time for, and they go into an organization with a completely transparent relationship. And I think it's important to know that when you screen your volunteers and you know your volunteers past, it lays the groundwork for future relationships that can be very, very meaningful for volunteers. And I found these two stories in the news. I'm a journalist, so I love to research people's stories. And Jeremy earned the mayor's commendation, who showed up to commend him with a news crew and everything for all of the work that he's done for years in the city of Harrisburg, where he volunteers actually thousands of his own dollars and hundreds of hours of his own time to clean up dump sites around the city for the community. It's pretty amazing. And then we have Clyde over here, who volunteers about 25 hours a week at the Jude 22 food pantry in Las Vegas. And he writes that he wants to live a meaningful life so that, people won't only see the stupid things he's done. And if you talk to the organization, they speak so highly of him. So we do want to make sure that we're always giving the message that it's about transparency and honesty as a foundation of trust for all of our volunteers that come in the door. It's not about having lived a perfect life. Another thing in the news is a quick story about unscreened volunteers that happened came out about a year ago in the news in Dayton, Ohio. And here is a volunteer bus driver who had worked with this organization, or maybe it was a church, for several years and had never been screened. And so when the news media tried to get a hold of them, they found out through multiple efforts that nobody ever said that they had background checked this volunteer. And that's very, very sad, because it impacts people's lives, it impacts their reputation, it impacts the whole community. And one other thing that's in the news that's coming more and more in the headlines, and actually is going to answer one of those questions that we received in the comments, is the increasing amount of national legislation for screening anybody who works with children and vulnerable populations. So just a tiny bit of history here, and if you download this slide, and you can follow, actually there's hyperlinks in there, but in 2003 the PROTECT Act was established to help volunteer groups obtain national and state fingerprint-based criminal history records, because groups are having a hard time accessing them through some of the different means that they were trying to screen volunteers. And then out of that came this Child Safety Protection Pilot Program. Now that's something that is a lot of words there, but basically the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children cooperated with the FBI, and they together, for a total of 8 years, they kept renewing this system. They ran random background checks on potential volunteers, and this is very specific to volunteers working with children and youth and in vulnerable populations at nonprofits, a very specific population. And what they found was that 6% of the 78,000 had criminal records, and that they had tried to hide them in various ways. One way that they tried to hide them was to that they applied to volunteer in a state differently from where they had committed the crime because they were familiar enough with the background checking system, right, Sherelle, that they were betting on the fact that maybe it wouldn't catch them in a different state.
Exactly.
And then about a fourth of that 6%, they would provide a different name or date of birth, and it's often common after a crime to change your name and not to provide your past names. So it's important to remember that there have been significant studies done to help nonprofits understand, kind of the percentages that are going to shake down when it comes to people applying to be volunteers with criminal records.
And the behavior and the fact that they do try to thwart having to get a background screen by moving to a different state, which, again, we're going to be talking later on a little bit about background screening services that are available that have county, state and county checks to make sure that the person who's volunteering at your organization doesn't have a criminal history from another state. So this is excellent research.
It is excellent research, and what it does is it points us to some best practices and what a really great background screen involves. The third line there in 2017 is very important, and this goes back to that nonprofit's question about how do I know whether my state is going to require fingerprints in the background check. So right now, Senators Orrin Hatch and Al Franken, you can go to their legislative pages. You'll see that they're trying to establish a national criminal history background check system for organizations to screen employees, volunteers, and coaches that serve children and other vulnerable populations. This is legislation that is bipartisan. It's been introduced in March. It's making its way through the legislative system. And what it's doing is making sure that organizations have access to that and letting them know when the fingerprints are necessary. That leads us to a few things, kind of a summary that I've called spot and stop of the different tactics that people have used to try to get around background screening.
Well, and I think, again, the most important aspect of this slide is for nonprofits to understand that, they're not going to always know the person has misrepresented their information unless they do a background screen. Based on what we've learned from the story so far, this spot and stop page, it's going to, it provides common tactics that the applicant uses that, again, if you have a comprehensive identity verification and background screen process in place, it's going to catch them. Many people, when they're, we're providing so much information all the time as individuals, and, you can transpose your social security number or your date of birth. That's very common, that mistakes that happen. But in the case of people that are trying to slip through the cracks, it's a tactic for them to be able to slip through the cracks so that they can avoid having their history be revealed. And so, this is a really important slide in helping nonprofits to understand just ways that a person tries to get around the system, and it's a great resource and a checklist for them to use as they're evaluating those volunteers that come through their doors, potential volunteers that come through their doors.
Right, and this isn't just our list. It's lists that came through stories that were submitted, and some of them actually were indicated by the findings of the Child Safety Protection Pilot Program that ran for 8 years. And the report you can find at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, how some of these tactics were enacted. So again, the important thing is you won't always be able to spot it from the paper that somebody fills out at your organization, right, Sherelle?
Right, and having a good partner, a background screening partner that, again, has a lot of, practice in spotting these, mistakes, if you will, and being able to, provide feedback and say that this person has a criminal history, or know that this person actually just made a mistake on their application, and actually they're okay. So again, it's just great to have a service provider that can help to bring light to these anomalies.
All righty. That's a good one. So some of the best practices for choosing a screening provider really come about as we consider some of these stories that we've talked about and some of the questions that people had. Then we kind of land on what is the way to choose a screening provider. And I think it's important to note that although we don't have a comparison slide here, that there are professional screening providers, and then there are also kind of do-it-yourself screening providers. So they're the ones that you just call in, maybe a number, and it's not verified in multiple ways. It's not verified in person. It may be a static database that an organization purchased. So a professional screening provider is an organization that is part of that has part of the FBI database, or they have access to criminal records nationwide. They do a nationwide search. They have county court runners, that verify the findings, and there's a lot of other different things that go into a professional screening service that are not part of maybe a do-it-yourself screening service.
Well, and I think again the takeaway from this slide is that there are many services available, and again with a wide range of costs, because that had been a question earlier, that are going to have different databases, depending, and to be honest, that the more, some of those services can be a little bit more expensive just based on the access that they have to, criminal history of individuals that are volunteering, or not necessarily volunteering, but just the amount of data that they have. So I think we just really want to make sure that the nonprofits understand that, one, a professional background screen service provides, you want one that provides unbiased vetting and a full service background search on your behalf. And again, it takes you out of the equation. So it's not that you're feeling bad that you have to turn someone away. You're relying on an organization that has experience in this area, and then that gives you the assurance and, that you can rest at night knowing that, they're taking responsibility for something that they're practiced in, and that is not your core competency. And again, in-person verification and collection of biometrics, again, if you partner with the background screening provider that provides these, this is a part of their practices, then it's a great way for you to know, again, that this person is who they claim to be, and they're not providing false documentation that would, again, slip through the cracks in other circumstances. Verifying identity, prevent inaccuracies. It'd be great if you had a background screening provider that had access to a nationwide database that they can do verifications of county at different counties to see if disposition from a person who maybe had gotten, maybe a DUI, and you don't know if they have a record, and
in another state,
and so they can verify that to see if that disposition, if they were sentenced, if it was a misdemeanor, if it was a felony. Again, it's great if you can have a service provider that provides that. And then, for me, I think as a nonprofit, what's so important is that initial background screen isn't going to always catch everything. And if you have a provider that has recurring screening as a part of their practices, then if you've missed something on an initial background screen, it's going to pick it up. And eventually if that person has done something that is criminal or, misdemeanor, then it's going to be caught. And that's going to, again, in the long run, protect your organization. So, this is a checklist for you to use as a nonprofit in choosing your background screening providers. That's a resource and a tool that'll help you.
Yeah, it's absolutely a great tool. And it's important to know that when you choose a professional background screening provider, you're actually protecting the applicant through that process, because they do have the ability, if something flags that they didn't even know was on there, it's possible that you're protecting the applicant's identity,
right.
you know, with a really great screening process.
And that's absolutely correct, Naomi, because people have had their identities stolen, and it's a way for them to say, no, this was not me. You know, my identity was stolen, and for them to get that corrected.
Right,
So
and that's what that number 5 is. The Fair Credit Reporting Act says that if something came up, the person needs to be notified. So we're going to wrap up, getting ready to wrap up here, and just want to remind you that we've talked about challenges nonprofits face. I think I actually skipped over that self-assessment tool in my technology here, but I want you to know that there is a self-assessment tool and checklist to help you implement screening in your organization, and somehow I apologize for skipping that. We've heard people's stories, we've got tips to spot and stop common tactics, and we talked about best practices. So next we're going to land on some identity solutions for screening volunteers. And Sherelle, I know you're an expert in this area. You know a lot about a new process for screening volunteers in the future that we're calling the Sure ID solution. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, here at Sure ID, we have a solution called Sure ID Certified Edge for volunteers. And it's a 2-part process. One is a verification of a person's identity, that they are who they claim to be, and then a comprehensive background screen that, you know, again, that helps to find if this person has a criminal history that could put your organization at risk. And we have several years of experience in this area, having partnered with the military, 5 branches of the military, to provide similar services for the vendors and contractors that access their military bases. And it's a great way for a nonprofit organization to, again, verify a person's identity and background to mitigate risk for your organization. And so if you go to the next slide, Naomi, it really is a very simple process for a volunteer to register for Sure ID Certified Edge. It begins online, where they input their biographic information, which includes their name, date of birth, social security number, and then they go on site to one of our safe and secure locations that are conveniently located across the country. And they complete the registration process by providing their biometric information, which would be their fingerprints, and also identity verification. And so, again, once they complete that process on site, then our professional staff of vetting and screening personnel verifies those documents and that the fingerprints are accurate. And once that person actually passes the verification process, that volunteer will receive their credential in the mail. And then what's great, again, about this system is very easy for the nonprofit to implement. They just download our app, and they're able to screen that volunteer once they have their credential to see if they're in an active status. So let's go to the next page, and let's look at how easy, again, is to validate for a nonprofit. So as a nonprofit, whether it's, you know, someone that's in your security department or your HR department that verifies the identity and the credentials of your nonprofits, once they have actually enrolled in the system and they've passed, you know, we want to make sure that they are active. So it's great that they've got their credential, but we want to make sure that they're active. And so each time they come into your organization to volunteer, you can screen them with your app, your smartphone app. And if for some reason it comes up as inactive, there's a variety of reasons. It could be because you know, their background screening, they failed it for some reason, or that it's in an inactive status. So, you know, again, it's a great way for you to verify that the person that is continuing to volunteer at your organization, their background is good.
Right, and with the recurring background screen, you just have that ongoing ability to continue to validate, the volunteer's credential that they are able to scan at the organization. And
so it's very easy as a nonprofit organization for you to accept SureID. So this is really what makes this program work, is that as a nonprofit, once you recommend that your volunteers, once you enroll as a nonprofit organization and say, yes, I accept SureID, and recommend that my volunteers also register into the program, then it's really just a 1-2 process. And that way, again, as your volunteers that are coming into your organization, it's just a great way for you to have that assurance that their identity has been verified, that they don't have a background that's going to compromise or put your organization at risk. And it's just a great way for you to mitigate risk as an organization. And all of this information is going to be available, again, through this deck being provided for you. And anyone who has additional questions, please write those in, and we will be sure to answer each and every one of those questions.
Absolutely, and we're excited to answer the questions because there's so many great answers out there. This is about solutions and stories, and it's about answers. And I also wanted to remind people that at the end of our deck, there's actually an appendix with some other great resources that they're going to be able to obtain today. Basil, I am very curious how it's been going there with the Twitter poll and what some of the comments have been in regards to the helpfulness of today's webinar.
All right, thank you, Naomi and Sherelle, for really a great presentation. I hope our listeners found a lot of value in sort of hearing these stories and seeing how they might compare with maybe something that happened at their organization, and really just to get a sense of, you're not alone. There are other folks out there experiencing very similar things, but fortunately we do have solutions like SureID's solution to really help sort of mitigate that risk. All right, let's take a quick moment to recap today's Twitter poll. Earlier when we started our session, we asked all of you, have you ever had to dismiss a volunteer at your organization? 78% said yes. 22% said no, with 9 votes in. That's pretty similar to the stats that we recapped earlier today. And actually, one of our listeners weighed in as to why she said she's had to dismiss a volunteer before. And we will keep her name hidden to ensure anonymity. But she says that she had to dismiss a volunteer for poor hygiene. The volunteer didn't take it well when they asked that volunteer to wear clothes with no holes in it or in them and take care of their body odor. They didn't take that very well. So I guess that would be a bit of a negative dismissal story. But a great story nonetheless. Thank you for sharing. And we also had another Twitter poll that we released about halfway through today's webinar. We asked, have you ever had a positive experience, vetting volunteers at your organization? With 6 votes in, 100% of you said yes. That's actually great to hear. It's always good to hear that vetting volunteers doesn't only lead to a negative situation. Really, it could be a positive, as we've seen through some of today's stories. All right, back to you, Naomi and Sherelle. Are we able to take a quick question before the end of the webinar?
I think we are running right up against the clock here, and I wanted to thank you, Basil, for mentioning a couple of those comments about people's positive and negative experiences. And the one thing that I would want to confirm, when you said 100% had had a positive experience in vetting volunteers. That was the story number 7 that we landed on with Paula. Remember that what we didn't read in there, she said it's often just like going out to coffee, and then she does the vetting and the screening, and she has all these policies. But it's 100% positive regardless of what the outcome is, because it's great for your organization, number one. But also the statistics show that 94% of volunteers that are vetted through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, their study, 94%, did not come back with criminal backgrounds. So, but that 6% can cause such incredible harm that's why we're having these webinars, because we know how important it is to keep our constituents safe, to keep our volunteers safe, and to protect all of the sensitive data and finances that for the important work that these organizations are doing. So thank you, Basil, for everything. Thank you, Sherelle, for your incredible expertise and the knowledge that you have in verifying and vetting volunteers. I know you've worked with SureID for a while, and I know that I'm an independent journalist, and I know it's been fun just to see the partnership between VolunteerMatch and SureID in this nonprofit space. Thank you, Sherelle.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience as well for participating in today's webinar.
I agree. Thanks so much, guys. To our listeners, if your question didn't get answered, please forward them along to Naomi and Sherelle. Their contact information is provided in the follow-up email, which you'll receive in about an hour. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so if you would like to recap parts of it later, it'll be up on our YouTube channel in just a couple of hours. Again, in about an hour, you'll receive an email from us with Naomi and Sherelle's contact information, and we'll also share a little more information about SureID's Certified Edge for those of you interested in signing up and taking the next step. Thanks again, Sherelle and Naomi, and thank you to our listeners for attending. We hope to see you all on a future VolunteerMatch webinar. Bye-bye.